you actually heard a lot about what we're going to discuss later in our presentation. So at that point in the presentation, I think it's best that we make it more interactive so you're not hearing the same things. The doctor upstairs talked a little bit more. We're going to focus more on the learning perspective. But as you all know, that learning is a process function that uses parts of our brain where we retain, recall, and restore information. So what we're going to discuss is maybe what some of us teachers don't know about the scientific portion.
Right. Okay, these are the three subjects that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about student-centered learning, the active portion of that. We're going to just review briefly some categories of learning theories, and then we're going to be delving into a little bit more of the theories of brain-based learning and how that works with neuroscience.
What's most important for me, just to give you a little background, I first learned about this brain-based learning when my colleague, what's the doctor name from 2nd Air Force, Dr. Ellis came to Maxwell and talked about brain-based learning. And it really, really piqued my interest because I never really saw it from that perspective. But it really does affect your practice if you take some of the implications that it has for you, which we'll discuss with you today. Let's take a look what some young minds think about brain-based learning. It's pretty interesting. Come on.
Not loud enough, or y'all need a little bit more?
A little more?
Okay.
Got it.
Increase this up a little bit.
Is that good? Okay.
Y'all get up and move around a little bit. After lunch. Okay.
He did say standing up helps, right?
Yeah. This is the brain that everybody has, and this is what controls you, and it's what makes up your personality. If you don't know how it ticks, then how do you know yourself?
The brain is really fascinating because it actually works out throughout your whole entire body, and the brain is like the main function in your body that controls what you do.
Neuroscience is the study of our brains, which is what makes us, us.
Because it can hold a lot of information at one time, and it helps your body work.
When the brain gets damaged, just like any computer, you have to find somebody to fix it, somebody able to fix it. So that's why we have neurologists, and it's important that we keep having them because we don't know the possibilities we can make in the advancement of science on the brain.
And neuroscience is a growing subject. There are lots of new areas inside of it, and every day we're learning something new about it. And it's just full of promises. So, yeah.
Neuroscience is cool!
So, student-centered learning. This, how many is this a new term or terminology for you? Okay, it's been around for a while. So, what are we comparing this to? Up until 15 years ago or so, maybe a little bit more, the instructor was in charge of the classroom. They were the holder of all information. They were the ones that would instill this information into their students, and it was from them that everything came from. In a student-centered learning experience, there's interaction, there's activities, there's discussions, there's debate. Come on in. Come on in. There is opportunities to share their past experiences and integrate those into their current unknown subject matter that they're talking about. They are now going from just trying to absorb information to the point where they can actually be not only the learners, but the the sharers of knowledge to their classmates. One of the other aspects of this is flipped learning. Now, this can be called a lot of different things. And even at Keesler, is anybody here from Keesler? One of the Keesler's classes has actually done some of this. They took some of their knowledge-based learning, recorded it, made it a short video clips of each one of the topics. So when the students would arrive the next day, they took that knowledge and then integrated that knowledge into a performance-based activity. So the instructor wasn't lecturing about something, they were taking that information and actually applying it in the in the class situation, and actually more effectively using that learning style. Once again, you know, we're taking the sage on the stage and moving them to the side. Now they become a facilitator. Okay, these are the three areas that we're going to look at just real briefly. The reason I want to do this is to just remind you where we came from. How many of you come from an educational background before you started working with the Air Force? Okay, a few of you. So for the rest of you, you came into either technical training or the educational realm from other specialties, either within the Air Force or maybe one of the other military services. I came into it from the Army, and I've got 15 years of experience as an instructional designer. Most of that prior to coming into working for the Air Force. So some of you, this may be review. For some of you, this may be just something to add to your toolbox. So we're going to be looking at behavioral learning, looking at one aspect of it of connectionism, cognitivism, constructivism, and then, of course, we're going to be looking at how this all feeds into brain-based learning and neuroscience. Okay. So going back in time to the turn of the century, there was a gentleman, and there were several of them. I just happened to pick Edward Thorndike. For the technical training folks, what did Edward Thorndike provide for us in our curriculum background in creating learning? Okay. How many of you have used the laws of learning? Hands? Okay. Edward Thorndike. He was a behavioral psychologist in the turn of the century. There's two things that's important to him from a standpoint of behavioral science and learning. He was the very first psychologist to interject scientific experimentation or scientific learning into the scientific world. In other words, he used experiments to figure out how does learning take place, and from an empirical standpoint. The other thing that he was famous for was the cat in the puzzle box. In behavioral learning, there was two main things that they were trying to discover. One, what caused learning, and how can we change a behavior through an external stimulus. So what Thorndike did, and I'm going to go through this real quick, he put a cat into a puzzle box, didn't feed it for a while, and put some food outside of a trap door. Now, what he wanted to see, how long would it take for the cat to figure out how to get out of that puzzle box? He didn't try to teach the cat how to do that. He didn't try to figure out how the cat was going to learn. He just was observing how the cat figured out that process. And what they did find out is that the more that they did this to the cat, and the cat finally got out, he didn't die in the process. The more often that they did this, the cat learned the tricks to get out of the box, and so the faster that he did it, shorter time frames. So that's one aspect. And probably 99% of all folks are familiar with Pavlov's drooling dogs, salivating dogs. Once again, external stimulus to create a response. And then this is a little bit more along from my teaching. John Watson, there was this is one of the first studies that was done with human beings, and it's one of the most heartbreaking ones. If you notice, I mentioned that Thorndike, he used animals, because up until that time frame, they weren't allowed to use human beings in experiments. John Watson decided to see how a child learned, and what he did over a period of time, he introduced very friendly animals that the baby's name was Albert. It's called the Albert experience, baby Albert experience. And what they did over time is start injecting a very loud noise when the baby would try to reach out and touch the animal. They included rats, rabbits, dogs. Little Albert was fine. When they started interjecting this negative stimulus, he started becoming afraid, and then they started reinforcing that. And it turned out when he was adult, he had to be in therapy for the rest of his life, because everything that had fur on it scared him to death. Finally, B.F. Skinner, one of the main proprietors of program learning. Let's see, there's a few folks that are about my age. How many learned how to read by the little reading modules? Okay, you read a story, you were able to answer the questions. If you answered enough of the questions right, you got to move up to the next level. All stem from program learning. Okay, next. Okay, cognitivism. So behavioral studies were still prevalent clear up until the 50s, late 50s, early 60s. Cognitivism started coming into play in the 60s and 70s. And these are a couple of the theories. There are others, but in cognitivism, they're looking at how can we take the senses, how can we take the environment, how can we take social situations, and our individuals or even governments to shape a person's mind and how they think. Cognitivism also brought to us how to work with the working memory, the short-term memory, long-term memory. Have you heard of the statement that a human can average 7 thoughts or 7 ideas at any given point, plus or minus 2, so between 5 and 9, came from here. Chunking, how many of us have used chunking? Okay, going from detailed to whole to detailed, cognitivism. They started using assessments, written ones, to verify what they feel the students should learn. All came from cognitivism. COBE, experimental learning. Have anybody except myself heard of this one? Okay. A few of you. Bless you. I had this particular style of learning in my undergraduate degree. It was a cohort, compressed bachelor's degree, and they used COBE. And the idea behind COBE was to learn about something, reflect on it, experience it, and then apply it. And in a lot of ways, the things that we teach are very much the same. We teach something, we remind them, we review, we summarize, we give appraisals to see how much they retained. We give them, if it's performance-based, we give them opportunities to put that to work. The more times that a subject is touched on in a variety of different ways, the higher the probability that the level of mastery will increase. Okay. Let's see. I want to talk about this one just a little bit. How many of us no, I tell you what. Well, no, I'm going to address it since it's up here. How many of you have had it mentioned that the brain is kind of like a computer? That one thing, I just want to make one statement that I disagree with. Computers run on zeros and one, on and off. We have, and this will go into neuroscience, so I'm not going to go very much into it. We operate with synapses that have neurotransmitters anywhere between 30 and 50 that cover all the aspects of the human brain that pass data and information. We are not computers. We are extremely more complex than computers. But we do use all of our sensory. How many of you, if you think back in time, can think about a very sweet smelling aroma, like cinnamon rolls, freshly baked bread, lasagna, chocolate cake? The senses, especially smells, are embedded into our memory. And once again, cognitives, they develop assessments, just like we do, to assess whether what they have presented has been embedded and at what level to their students. Just like behavioralists, they knew that the brain, something was going on in there. Not really sure what it is because they didn't have the imagery or the technology that we do now. So even though that they could assess what was going on in the brain, they still considered it a black box. Okay. Constructivism. This is probably one of the ones, especially for those that work with performance-based tasks, that we utilize the most. We work in activities, whether it's taking apart a radio, whether it is working on a computer. We are talking, we are getting them interactive. There's discussions between them. You know, if we were in an outside setting, there'd be blogging going on.
I just want to add one thing about constructivists. This is where the student-centered learning or the active learning first started, because that's when they realized that the learners brought themselves into the situation, their experiences, they were at different stages of development, yet they recognized that they needed to make meaning out of what they already knew. I like to kind of refer to it as, anybody heard of Malcolm Knowles? He was the one that, andragogy. I think this is probably the era that he was in, because that's when they looked to the student to help bring the learning experience to life. Okay? I do think also this may have been the beginning of when educators began to think like scientists. So with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at the neuroscience of learning.
The first thing we have to ask ourselves is, what is learning? Learning is a process. So learning is a process that enables human beings to adapt, to grow, to survive. Therefore, it has a very natural function. What's going on inside our heads that enables us to learn new things, remember them, and then act on them later so that we will survive? When we apply the neuroscience of learning, and by the neuroscience I mean both the biological and the psychological elements of how our brain works, we find that there's 4 variables, and it can be described very simply by the acronym AGES. We need attention, we need generation, we need emotion, and we need spacing. And to the spacing part, I would add repetition and retrieval as well. In order to learn something, we have to pay attention to it. Our attention is always being challenged on a minute-by-minute basis. If we're not focused in on what we're learning, if we're not paying attention to it in the moment without any distraction, we're never going to be able to remember it. Make sure that people have frequent breaks. It doesn't need to be a long break, but the science shows us that people only can pay attention for 15, 20 minutes at a time before their brains begin to get tired. The time that you've used in the breaks pays back tremendous dividends. What we mean by generation is when the learner generates their own meaning out of what's been learned, when they're able to associate the new learning with things they already know, with knowledge and skill they already have. We achieve generation by keeping people active, by giving them activities and exercises that helps them come up with that meaning. We all can remember where we were when something fantastic or dramatic happened. We remember those things, and we remember the surroundings, we remember what we were doing, we remember who we were with. What we want to do is attach emotion to the learning environment. If we can get people motivated to access their motivation of why they want to learn these things, what good it will do for them, the dopamine in their brains is activated, this activates their hippocampus, and now the memory receptors are turned on. If people know that they're going to be called on, if they're going to have to respond to each other, they're going to be more emotionally committed. Spacing learning out over time has tremendous benefit, especially when it's coupled with this idea of repetition and retrieval. Most corporate learning development programs that we see do not take this last part into account. They want people to get into a classroom for a day or 2 days or a week, fill their heads with things, let them go off, and what happens inevitably is within 30 or 60 days, most people have forgotten what they learned. And the final thing, and this is very, very important, to keep emphasizing at the beginning, middle, and end of the training is, what's their goal? Why are they here? How are they going to use that? And everyone is going to have a different answer to that question. You want to keep weaving that in. You want to tell them how other people have used this information and how valuable it could be to them. Get them to always be reflecting on how they're going to use this going forward.
So let's examine this neuroscience down through the ages. A lot of what Dr. Doyle spoke about was really what you just heard on that video. But what we want to talk about today, we want to make it a little more interactive because, again, it's some of the same information he just shared. But what we want to discuss is how that is going to affect our practices. Here are some of the things that will help you from an instructional perspective. You want to be the guide on the side. You want to provide structure, but you don't want to be very directive, because we're dealing with students who want to be a part of the training, the entire process, determine how they learn, what they learn. You also want to accept and respect every student's point of view. Of course, we don't always agree with every student's point of view. I don't know about you all's training, but I was taught to say, yeah, don't tell them they're wrong, right? Because you don't want to shut them down. That's basically what that means. Respect every student's point of view. Recognize that they bring different experiences into the situation. Give them permission to assist in their own learning. It may be something unorthodox to us, but it may be just how they learn. So invite them to do that. Dr. Doyle talked about having the balls in his room. Do something like that. It tells us to keep our classrooms the way our brains learn, so that the students will retain more of what we're trying to teach them. And also, we want to use some strategies like role playing to get the students involved. Also, gaming helps, just some student interactive activities, not just you sit down, I speak to you. And John spoke a little bit earlier about the flipped classroom, where there were videos and the students would do the homework at night, and then the instructor would just fill in the gaps the next day. That way the instructor didn't have the full teaching load, but the students were able to get the information that was best, that they best learned from. And as we talk about our learners, Dr. Doyle also indicated this. He talked about those neural connections that our learners make. Those connections are through two types of learning. One is called neuroplasticity. Anybody heard of that one? And neurogenesis. What does neuroplasticity tell you, Sergeant Keys? You heard of it, right?
So yes, ma'am, yes, I've heard of it, but not if we knew what it was. So,
Okay, okay. Would anybody like to share what they?
It has to do with the changes occurring, whereas the other one would be like new connections, I guess.
Perfect, absolutely. Neuroplasticity means that the brain can remap, reshape, reorganize. That's neuroplasticity. Neurogenesis means that we can develop new neural connections when we learn something new or when there is new stimulus that we can relate to. In fact, it is shown that the brain itself literally changes. John and I talked yesterday, and he was saying that he's seen studies where a lot of your brain would light up when information, new information is in there to show those neural connections being made. So those are two of the things that we need to know as the teacher and as our learners. And those are the two processes that the brain goes through. Just like Dr. Doyle also said, the brain needs to be fed like every other organ in our body. And yes, it needs proteins and it needs energy. The energy it needs can also be the form of emotions and stress. That gives us energy too, but I'm going to speak more about that in just a second. And sleep, no question about that. He told us about that. Does anybody remember what he said about the nutrients and what it does?
Start drinking it too.
What was that? Start drinking it? Drinks? He did talk about the water and water first thing in the morning, right? He did mention beer too, remember? Yes, he mentioned beer, maybe not the ideal drink, but it is some water. But the brain needs that because he said you get dehydrated at night. So we need those nutrients because if we don't get them, our brains are not going to react to the situation. What's interesting about emotion is that our emotional state either enhances or impedes our learning. So if you're stressed, what do you think is going to happen that morning? Think about your students. What do you see? Students come in stressed about something that happened at home, maybe. What do you see?
Distraction.
Distraction. Can't focus. Exactly right. And they're definitely having these problems in the schools today with our youngsters. So that is also a problem. Exercise. Exercise brings about that dopamine in our body. We need some stress though. We need some stress to learn. We don't need to be overstressed. We don't want the flight or the fight stress, but we need just a little bit of stress so we can have an urgency to learn. So we need to give a little, or we need to take some away. What I like to say too, if you've got students who may be stressed, maybe you can play some classical music or some relaxing music. Conversely, if you have students who need to up the ante a bit, maybe you could play more upbeat music to get them going. Now, sleep. I promise you that sleep I found for myself. Just like Dr. Doyle was saying, I could be working on something that is so simple and it just never comes. I wake up the next morning and it's like, that's the answer, because I was deprived. But once I get my sleep and I throw the other things unconsciously out of the way, I can focus on what I need to focus. So those are imperative to our learning. Also, he talked about the prefrontal cortex, and John is so thrilled by this that he's going to talk about that as it relates to Bloom's taxonomy.
We're not going to, don't worry, we're not going to get into all the big words, because mostly I can't pronounce them right now anyway. But we're going to take a look at some of these. As far as Bloom's taxonomy, that hierarchy where it goes from regurgitation of information clear up to the creating or duplicating of some new process. Within the brain itself, it has areas just specific for that those areas pertain to. There's areas for emotions. There's areas for the memory, and this isn't just cramming at night. We've heard both on videos and Dr. Doyle mentioned that you need time in between sessions of instructions to allow for either reflection or for that. He gave the example of sleep for those memories to be seated within the brain. And in the area of the neocortex, we're looking at the volitional control. If we're looking at a individual's motivation, we're looking at that. And so, in doing so, we've mentioned that the frontal cortex does several things. Dr. Doyle mentioned that it's one of the last parts of the brain that matures. That's the reasons why men under the age of 26 aren't allowed to drive rental cars. They don't make good decisions. And you look at the average age of most of our students that we work with. They're between 18 and 20, 24, 26. We do have a few older students in there, but there's some of them, just because of their age and their maturity, the decisions that they're making, like staying up to 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning playing Call of Duty, at the moment at 8 o'clock, that sounded like a great idea. And it didn't occur to them when they got to midnight, it might be an idea, because they have a test the next day, to go to sleep. Don't make good decisions. Okay.
Is that it? Okay. I think one other thing I'd like to mention, as you can see, the lower parts of the brain does the lower order thinking skills, and the highest part of the brain, that's where the most thinking or the critical thinking happens as part of your process. Here are some things that we need to consider as we look at the brain-based or learning or neuroscience. We talked about those neural connections being remapped, reorganized, and just changing. That's because of new experiences, learning new concepts. Sometimes that can also be because of some emotional factor that learner or we have gone through. Another thing is that the brain, believe it or not, can multitask, but here's the difference. Our sleep, our exercise, our emotional state, as well affect how well we can do, or our brain can do multiple things at once. So everything pretty much needs to be in homeostasis in order for us to multitask well. And some of the information is stored in different parts of our brain. I think John just covered that quite well. But also, our brain changes as we grow, as we get older, as we mature. As he just said, 26, you really don't mature till you're about 26 years old. And I thought what was most important is that the meaning has to be made. We've talked about that all along this presentation. If meaning isn't made, then that learning, it may take place surface, but it won't stay. But what I found most interesting is that a person's intelligence is not static. Not only is it not static, but it is also a genetic factor. Maybe how well they multitask is a genetic factor, or what part of the brain is activated first is a genetic factor. But a lot of times, not only do people's intelligence changes, as we indicated, the brain changes because you are exposed to something different and your learning style changes. I was telling someone the other day, when I was younger, I used to be primarily auditory. But as I get older, I have to be tactile and I have to see it. But I think it was getting that doctorate degree that changed all that. Honestly, I do. But again, your brain does change as you're exposed to different things. And next, we're going to discuss the working memory and the long-term memory. Dr. Doyle also discussed those briefly.
Okay. So what do these different aspects of the brain have implications on how we learn? With the working memory, it's just there for a moment. Even during our time here at this conference, how many of you were introduced to somebody and you walk away and you can't think for the life of you what that person's name is? Just gone. It's what you do with it. Is the information goal related? Going back to some of our other learning theories, there's some repeated commonalities there. You have to get their attention. You have to demonstrate how it's meaningful for them, especially when we're talking about adult learners. If you can't demonstrate how what they're learning is going to positively impact them either on a professional or a personal level, you're probably going to lose them within the first 30 seconds. Limited time. I know most of our courses, you're teaching 50 minutes, and then you take a break. And it's just jam-packed full of information. And then you go on to the next subject. And then you take a break, and then you go on to the next subject. And then you expect them to take all that information on minimal amount of sleep and hope that they can remember it the next day. And a lot of cases it won't, because as Dr. Doyle presented, with less than adequate amount of sleep, those memories don't get integrated into your brain. And new information. The new information that we take in, most of us might think that there's just one neural channel that all your memories go through. But what happens is that when you start activating that memory again, more neural paths are created. The bandwidth gets wider. it is accessed more easy. That's the reason why individuals that suffer from Alzheimer's or dementia, the reason that they can access long-time memories but can't access short-term memories is because they had the neural pathways to those memories have broken down. They can't find that information anymore. And in working with all these different types of memories and these concepts, when we're teaching, we have to take this into account. Yes, all of us have just tons of information we have to pass on to our students. Maybe we can think of different ways that we can chunk that up a little bit better and have times of when they could reflect on it and approach it a different way and enable that long-term connection to take place.
That was great, John. I like to think of working memory as computer RAM. You know, you only access it when you need it, and the long-term memory more like the computer ROM. It's there, you just have to retrieve it. Let's take a look at some, I just want to show you right now just a website that has 28 active teaching strategies on them. If you want to copy this, I'll leave this up. I was introduced to these 28 strategies by Dr. Ellis and Ms. Ward from 2nd Air Force. And I know that our educational advisor, Dr. Maggart, she likes to use some of those, but they really are great strategies to get away from the sage on the stage and to activate those active learning strategies. A great way to take a lesson objective, maybe that you have that's not the best or most exciting for your students, or maybe the most difficult. And perhaps you can use a lot of these strategies that are listed. Okay, we discussed a lot with you today that was very exciting for us. We first talked about the student-centered or active learning, and that's basically when students are part of that learning process, when they have a say about maybe their assessment, how much they can contribute to the classroom, and not just take everything from that teacher. We also looked at the learning theories, the behavioralists, cognitivists, constructivists, and of course the brain-based neuroscience. And if you look over the eras of the U.S., you can see where each of those areas, types of learning, were emphasized just in our training as kids to adulthood. And finally, we talked about the implications for us as instructors and for our students, and for some new ways of using active learning strategies to get away from the traditional teacher telling, student receiving. With that in mind, are there any questions? Yes?
Have you ever considered factoring in the theory of multiple intelligences into your briefing, or have you done any study on that? Or?
No, but I do think some of that is one of those 28 strategies. Okay. And I know we have heard about AR and AI and those type of things, but I haven't factored that into this, but that's a consideration.
And to make sure that I heard, did you say emotional intelligence?
Multiple.
Multiple intelligence.
Like, you know, for instance, someone may not be very mathematical,
right,
but they could be very intelligent in the field of music, or,
right,
or interpersonal versus interpersonal, etc. You know.
Okay, that's a perspective you meant. Yes. In fact, I didn't mention this, and I meant to. Has anybody heard of Malcolm Gladwell? It goes to that theory, correct? He wrote a book called Outliers in 2008, and he talked about successful people, and they were outliers because they became successful despite some other issues, despite where they grew up, despite how much education they had, they still became successful. And one of the things that he emphasized was you can master a skill if you practice 10,000 hours. Similar to what Dr. Doyle said earlier. And I thought about it personally, and I could fit it to some skills when I'm trying to become an expert, from novice to expert. Think about it. To do that, it takes a lot of studying or practice or something. So I guess in that regard, yes.
Oh yeah, that's great. She was saying that she had thought about it before as well, but just like another aspect of that I've heard is using that person's strength and that particular type of intelligence to undergird learning in other areas, other cognitive areas.
Gotcha.
To be able to use that as a scaffold off of, etc. So if someone, say, isn't very good mathematically, but they are good musically, you might be able to use the mathematical type things that go on in music to undergird those mathematical skills on the others. It's just,
Gotcha.
Sure.
It makes sense.
Yes. I had a question. Mine's more of a Barnes Center specific. We've had several briefings on the new ecosystem. What part of the ecosystem is the Barnes Center going to play in that? I know you guys went through some restructuring a few years ago. Do you have? Is there a purpose-built plan that's going to integrate the Barnes Enlisted Education Center into the new ecosystem that's coming up?
We have not looked at that. However, one of the things I have been, trying to pursue is including like the knowledge part in our curriculum. In other words, we have an e-portfolio function in our learning management system. So we were looking at least including some of that in our curriculum, but the Air Force doesn't have anything that we can make Air Force-wide, because what our students learn in our curriculum will help them in their careers. So that's the only perspective we've looked at, and it hasn't, we've got to wait for that AFSLI to mature before we consider it further, but there has not been anything else. Has there been anything else you've heard about, Dr. Maggart? Okay.
Okay, I was just curious because as I've always seen, you guys had this independent learning management system that just was there, and it was kind of in between. I always saw that you guys is kind of in between the paper and electronic. You guys were just kind of right here, and this would have been a chance to shift completely to more of a blended kind of.
Because we're going to a new learning management system, that adds to the complexity. So, but that was a great question. Were there any others? Did you want to share what you experienced? Oh, okay. You sure? Yeah, I want you to go ahead and share what she experienced with the question that you asked, if you don't mind. The question that he asked about the...
Someone was asking about multiple intelligences. It's something I've taught before, especially with students that struggle, but more younger than adult learners that we're talking about as the focus of this week. I was a counselor at the time. I started out by writing on the page, you are, and I got to the S because, we know we're special, And I know it's not that you're not special, but it's that you're smarter than you think. So people who have struggled with school, struggled with learning, will often find that they need that time, like you said, with math being behind music. I might know I'm good at music, but let me help you understand. There's math that leads into that. And so helping them understand that they are using their strengths. Some of you are familiar with Strengths Finder book, the 2.0. Helping them understand those strengths that lead to their successes in the classroom and the application of classroom materials.
Very good. That's a great summary. Great summary. Were there any other questions before we end? John, do you have anything else?
I don't have anything else. I appreciate all your attention and for participating and for your questions afterwards. Just want to emphasize, at least my goal was to help spur your interest in your own research. See how this could apply, these principles could apply in your own situation. And if that does that for your situation, I'm happy that we were able to share it.
And not just to share that with your situation, but just know that there are things out there that can help you with your practice. You're not out there by yourself. But we have enjoyed you immensely. We appreciate the huge crowd, and I hope you enjoyed the session. Thank you so much.